I've just opened my mouth to start talking awkwardly, and it was already doing 5 seconds of this. That's awkward. All right, everyone. Today we're talking about the last check on Parliament, or the last restriction on parliamentary's ability to make laws. And this one is called the double majority referendum. So you can see in the study design, we've done the other 4 dot points, and now we need to know what the requirement for a double majority referendum is, and we need to know its strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so it's strengths and weaknesses today. Okay, so what is a referendum? A referendum is a vote by the Australian people to change the wording of the Constitution. This acts as a restriction on Parliament, as the Parliament cannot make laws that change the Constitution without the support of the Australian people. So there are 2 kind of main things that we need to do in order to start or a referendum in Australia. The first one is it's got to go through Parliament. That means that Parliament will propose to alter the Australian Constitution through a bill. That bill will need to be passed by both houses of the Commonwealth Parliament, or alternatively one house twice before a referendum begins. So it would either go through the House of Reps and the Senate, or it might go through the House of Reps twice within a 3-month period. Once it's done that, information will be sent to all households around the proposed changes, so people have an understanding of the referendum and what it's about. And then from there, everyone will need to vote on this, including all people in the House of Reps and the Senate. And this vote needs to occur 2 months after the bill has been passed and 6 months before the bill. Okay, the referendum, in order for the referendum to pass, it must have the majority of all voters across Australia, including the territories, which means 50% of people plus 1 person is the majority of all voters. So if we look at 10 people have voted in a referendum, 50% of that is 5 people, plus 1 more person is 6. So that would equal a majority. Okay, so 4 to 6. Okay, so the majority of people across all voters, and it also requires the majority of a yes vote across the states. Okay, as some states have larger populations than others, a larger state may vote yes to a referendum, but a smaller state may actually vote no, and there'd still be a majority of voters all up. So we'll explain that a little bit more in detail, but in order for a successful referendum to pass, just like I've said, the double majority provision provides that the majority of voters must say yes and the majority of states must say yes. So let's look at what that looks like visually. Okay, so in this referendum, we've got everyone across Australia has said yes, great big green tick. And then we see in the smaller states, we've got a majority of voters just living in WA that have said yes. We've got a majority of voters living in Queensland that have said yes, and Victoria and Tassie. And while we've got a no vote from South Australia and a no vote for New South Wales. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 states out of 6 have said yes, and 2 have said no, which means that this referendum would pass. Okay. Alternatively, we might get something that looks a little bit like this, where you've got the majority of no voters, and we've also got, you can see a lot of states here, 3 out of 3 states have said no as well. Okay, so it can be quite difficult for a referendum to achieve, and you can see here with this statistic that 8 out of 44 referendums that have been held in Australia history have been successful. So not a lot of referendums have ever passed, which means that voters have to be really, really sure and really, really confident of the changes in the Constitution to do it. As a general rule, Australian voters are rather conservative, and you can see that from this statistic. So how does it act as a restriction or a check? Well, some of the strengths include this idea, or some of the ways in which it's a strength include the idea that Section 128 allows public to refuse support for the proposed changes if it's deemed inappropriate. That means that the Commonwealth cannot make laws that may increase its power, because people will still need to vote on that. The second one here is the double majority is quite strict, which means that only changes that have really been thought about and consulted and supported by the community will occur. Thirdly, the double majority acts to protect smaller states, so that Tasmania and South Australia, such as Tasmania and South Australia, will be able to say no, even if the bigger states say yes, or vice versa. Smaller states could say yes, and the bigger states could say no. Okay, so they're part of it. The majority vote is compulsory, which means that it removes Commonwealth's ability to kind of decide how the Constitution will be changed, and rather puts it in the hands of our voters, because everyone has to participate. And lastly, it's a fairly lengthy process, which is a positive because it requires both a bill through Parliament as well as the proposed change. Some of the problems or weaknesses of this, or how it may not prevent an abuse of power. Sometimes people don't really understand the change. They may just decide to agree with a politician. Sometimes it's a really great change, but it's hard for the double majority to actually occur, which means that even if good changes are proposed, doesn't mean that people will be able to support them. It's time consuming and costly. So we can see that the 1999 referendum cost $66 million. How does that act as a check? Maybe the Parliament may be unwilling to take things further for a referendum, as it seems like a waste of money. Similarly, if a referendum is proposed that increases the Commonwealth Parliament, the only action the states can do to shift this power as a result of a referendum is to strongly lobby against the referendum. So that means that if people support a strong change in power, there's nothing smaller states can do about it. And lastly, sometimes double majorities can be undemocratic, as often they occur on the same time as elections, and often people may not know necessarily what they're either voting for, or the fact that you may not get necessarily, or you may only get 3 out of 6 states supporting it, but 62% of people who actually agree with it. So sometimes the result doesn't pass, even if we've got a majority of voters across Australia, because it doesn't actually meet the state requirement as well. Okay, that's it for today. Yay, done.